All right, so we're really diving into some big questions today, the kind that really make you think about global inequality. And we're starting with Jared Diamond's guns, Germs and Steel, which you've been digging into. It's kind of like trying to understand why history turned out so differently for different societies, like why some ended up with more stuff.
What's great about Diamond's approach is how he just tackles those kind of uncomfortable questions directly. I mean, he's not shying away from these big gaps in, like, power and wealth, but he's digging deeper than those simple explanations we often hear, which, let's face it, can be pretty biased. He's searching for what he calls ultimate causes. And get this, he thinks they might be hiding in plain sight. Geography.
Geography. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. It seems like a big jump from like mountains and rivers to empires and technology.
Think of it like a chain reaction. One thing leads to another. And Diamond starts with this story, a perfect illustration. He's chatting with Yali, this new Guinean politician, who asks this seemingly simple question. Why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but us black people had so little of our own?
Wow, that's a really straightforward question, but it cuts right to the core, doesn't it? It's about more than just like material possessions. It's about power and development, like why some seem to be favored by history more than others.
Exactly. And Diamond insists the answer isn't about one group being like inherently better than another. No, he's looking deeper at the
Yeah.
underlying reasons.
Yeah.
And to get that, we got to rewind way back to when everyone was a hunter-gatherer.
Okay, back to square one. Everyone's hunting and gathering, but then something shifts, right?
Precisely. Farming. That was the big change. But here's the thing. This change, it didn't happen everywhere at the same time. Some regions got a head start. And that, my friend, changed everything. Diamond points to the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East as an example of a region that just hit the geographic jackpot when it came to food.
So what was so special about this Fertile Crescent? Was it just like good soil and lots of sun?
It was more than just good soil and sunshine, though they certainly helped. Imagine this. Predictable rain, wet winters, dry summers, and a good mix of altitudes. This variety, all packed into one area, it was crucial.
Variety. Why was that so important?
Because it meant that they could grow a wider variety of plants,
Mhm.
right? The Fertile Crescent wasn't stuck with just one type of crop. And really importantly, it was home to the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, which were, well, perfect for early domestication.
It's like those plants were just waiting for humans to discover them. But Diamond also mentions how the way these plants reproduced gave the Fertile Crescent a leg up, right?
Absolutely. Wheat and barley, they're what we call self-pollinating. Now, I know that sounds a bit technical, but it basically means that they consistently pass on those good traits to their offspring. And that was a game changer for those early farmers. They were much more likely to get a good, predictable harvest year after year. Other regions weren't so lucky. Their main crops, they needed more complicated ways of pollinating, making it way harder to get those reliable harvests.
It's incredible how these tiny differences in how plants reproduce could have such a huge impact on, well, everything. But it wasn't just plants, was it? Diamond also talks about how the Fertile Crescent was good for domesticating animals.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where Diamond's writing really shines. He uses these really vivid examples, like comparing zebras and horses. You might think, a zebra is just a striped horse, right? But when it comes to domesticating them, there's a world of difference.
Okay, spill the beans. What's the deal with zebras? Why weren't there zebra chariots pulling folks around in ancient Rome?
Well, those stripes, they're not just for looks. They actually made zebras a terrible choice for domestication. And, well, let's just say some ancient farmers learned that the hard way. Zebras, they're known for being aggressive. They bite, they kick, and good luck trying to put a saddle on one. Horses, on the other hand, well, they were practically begging to be domesticated compared to zebras.
So Eurasia had more horses, and more horses meant better transportation, which led to faster development.
You got it. But it wasn't just horses. Eurasia had this huge variety of big mammals that were perfect for domestication. Cows, pigs, sheep, goats. This gave them a huge advantage when it came to food, labor, even warfare.
Okay, so having more animals you could domesticate, it makes sense that would give you a leg up. But this is where things get a little tricky for me. Weren't there also downsides to having all those domesticated animals around? I'm thinking about diseases specifically.
That's a really good point, and you're right. This is where Diamond's argument takes a bit of a dark turn. He says that living so closely with animals, while it had its benefits, also came with what he calls a lethal gift.
Lethal gift. That doesn't sound too great.
No, not really. Close contact with animals led to all these infectious diseases, things like smallpox, measles, influenza. These diseases jumped from animals to humans, and while they were devastating to those early farmers, over time, those populations started to build up some resistance.
Ah, so it's kind of a double-edged sword then.
Exactly. And this accidental consequence of domesticating animals, well, it had a massive ripple effect on history.
So those early farmers, they're reaping the benefits of agriculture, right? And they've got
Right.
all these animals. But at the same time, they're kind of unknowingly setting the stage for this whole new chapter, one where those lethal gifts, as Diamond calls them, have a really, really dark impact.
And you see that impact most tragically in the European conquest of the Americas.
Yeah.
Diamond's point is that when Europeans showed up, they brought with them all these diseases, right?
Yeah.
The ones they'd been building up resistance to for centuries. And it was like unleashing a biological weapon on people who had zero immunity. It's impossible to overstate how devastating that was. Entire civilizations wiped out.
It's kind of terrifying, this invisible force completely changing the course of history.
Yeah.
But why didn't it go the other way? Why didn't Europeans get hit by American diseases the same way?
It's a question that puzzled historians for ages. But Diamond actually offers a pretty convincing answer. Remember how we were talking about the limited number of domesticated animals in the Americas? Well, fewer animals, fewer chances for those diseases to make the jump to humans. Plus, the Americas didn't have these huge, densely packed populations until way later in their history. Those are the perfect breeding grounds for epidemics.
So it's like this awful twist, right? The same thing that gave Eurasian societies an advantage, all those animals and the food production that went with them also made them carriers of disease. And when they started exploring the world, those germs became this unintentional weapon.
Exactly. It shows how progress can have these unintended and sometimes really terrible consequences. And this pattern, it pops up in other ways too. Diamond talks about how the tropics, for example, were another kind of disease barrier for Europeans.
Right, like Africa, Southeast Asia, New Guinea. It took Europeans a really long time to colonize those places. What was it about those environments?
Diamond says it was the diseases. They were a whole different ballgame in the tropics. Malaria, yellow fever, cholera. Europeans had very little resistance to those. The tropics became this kind of invisible shield, really slowing down their colonization efforts for centuries.
So it wasn't just a one-way street when it came to germs. Europeans weren't just bringing diseases, they were encountering them too. It really makes you rethink that whole narrative of inevitable European dominance.
It definitely adds some complexity. That back and forth, that disease resistance and susceptibility, it hugely impacted how different parts of the world were colonized, settled, how they ultimately developed. But germs, they weren't the only factor, of course. Diamond also argues that literacy, being able to read and write, was absolutely crucial for societies to become more complex.
Yeah, that makes sense. You need to be able to write things down, share knowledge, build on what others have learned to have any kind of advanced society.
Exactly. Diamond, he goes deep into how writing began, tracing it back to these key spots like Sumerian cuneiform in Mesopotamia or the writing systems they had in early Mesoamerica. He thinks these were the main hubs, the places where the idea of writing spread from, either by people directly copying it or just being inspired to create their own systems.
So, similar to the wheel, it wasn't that other societies couldn't develop writing, it's just that it had already spread by the time they might have come up with it on their own.
Exactly. And Diamond really stresses how hard it was to invent a writing system from scratch. It took centuries, millennia even, of trial and error. Imagine trying to come up with symbols for every single thought, every sound, without any example to follow. It boggles the mind.
It really does. But I bet once you had a writing system, it opened up so many possibilities.
Absolutely. It wasn't just for grocery lists. Writing was essential for keeping records, for administration, for passing down knowledge. It even helped develop more complex political systems. Think laws, contracts, religious texts, even propaganda. It's nearly impossible to maintain and spread those things without writing.
It's like writing was the backbone these early empires, these sprawling civilizations needed to exist.
Exactly. And Diamond argues that, just like with writing, geography also influenced technology, how it developed, how it spread.
Okay, let me guess. Eurasia wins again. Bigger landmass, more resources, faster progress.
You're getting good at this. Diamond says that because Eurasia was so big and interconnected, technology just developed faster there. More people, more potential inventors, more competition, more pressure to come up with something new. And those east-west routes we talked about, they meant that those inventions could spread quickly.
But in the Americas, with their north-south layout and smaller, more isolated populations, new ideas, they didn't spread as easily, right?
That's the idea. Diamond talks about guns as an example. They were invented in China, but it was the Europeans who really perfected them and, well, used them to conquer a lot of the world.
And Diamond would say that wasn't because Europeans were just naturally more warlike or innovative, but because they had the resources, the connections, everything they needed to really develop and use those technologies on a larger scale.
Exactly. It reminds us that technology doesn't just appear out of thin air. There are all these other factors, including geography, that influence it.
This is all so fascinating. It's incredible how all these seemingly unrelated things, geography, food production, disease, literacy, technology, they all come together to explain why different societies developed in such different ways, like pieces of a giant puzzle.
That's exactly what Diamond wants us to see, how interconnected it all is. He's not saying geography is destiny, but it lays the groundwork. It creates both opportunities and limitations that, when combined with other events, create this ripple effect that shapes civilizations.
So it's a more, well, sophisticated way of looking at history. It moves beyond those simplistic explanations like Europeans were smarter or Africans were lazier, right?
Exactly. It's about understanding these deeper forces that have shaped our world for a really long time.
This is blowing my mind, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface of what Diamond covers in his book. He doesn't just stop at Eurasia and the Americas, does he?
You're right. We focused on these two, but Diamond takes his ideas and applies them to other parts of the world too. Australia, New Guinea, Africa, China. Each region has its own unique story, its own mix of geographic advantages and disadvantages.
Okay, I'm ready for more. Where to next on our global tour of Diamond's big ideas?
Australia. It's kind of a perfect case study, totally isolated geographically speaking. And Diamond argues that that isolation really shaped how Aboriginal societies developed.
So different continent, different set of rules. How'd those ultimate causes play out down under?
Australia, it kind of threw a wrench in things.
Yeah.
I mean, the environment, it's completely different from Eurasia. Way drier, less fertile, and there just weren't as many plants and animals they could easily domesticate. Just imagine, no vast wheat fields, no herds of sheep, at least not until much, much later when Europeans showed up.
So it makes sense that Aboriginal Australians would have stuck with hunting and gathering for a lot longer.
Yeah, exactly. But Diamond really emphasizes that they weren't, like, behind or anything. They were incredibly skilled at adapting to that environment. He talks about how sophisticated their land management techniques were, especially their use of fire.
Wait, fire?
Yeah.
Like controlled burns to encourage certain plants to grow? That's some seriously advanced stuff.
It really is. They knew what they were doing, that's for sure. But then you look at technology, and it gets even more interesting. Diamond talks about the Tasmanians, the Aboriginal people who lived on that island off the coast of Australia.
Right, right. What happened there?
Well, they actually had simpler tools than the Aboriginal people living on the mainland. And over time, they actually lost certain technologies that they used to have.
Whoa, hold on. Societies can actually go backwards when it comes to technology. That seems kind of counterintuitive.
It happens. And Diamond thinks it's because of that isolation. The Tasmanians, they were more isolated, even compared to mainland Australia. Less contact means less sharing of ideas, fewer chances to pick up new technologies, or even just hold on to the ones they already had.
It's like use it or lose it, but for technology, for entire societies, mind-blowing.
Right. And of course, we can't talk about Australia without acknowledging the devastating impact of European colonization. Sadly, it's a similar story to the Americas. European diseases, their advanced technology, their different way of organizing themselves, it all gave them this huge advantage, leading to, well, the story, dispossession and cultural disruption on a massive scale. It's a tragic pattern we see again and again.
It really is. But before we move on, what about New Guinea? We touched on it earlier. The Austronesians, those incredible sailors, they settled along the coasts, but they never really made it into the highlands. Diamond says that's because the indigenous groups there, they were already such skilled farmers that they didn't really need to, right?
That's a big part of it, yeah. New Guinea's fascinating because it's just incredibly diverse, ecologically, culturally, you name it. And the people living in those highlands, they developed agriculture totally independently. They were domesticating a completely different set of plants than we see over in the Fertile Crescent.
Different crops, but the same idea. That agriculture is this foundation for building bigger, more complex societies.
Exactly. But there's a twist. Even though they developed agriculture on their own, those societies in New Guinea, they didn't develop the same levels of technology or political organization that you see elsewhere.
Why not? If agriculture is such a game changer, what was holding them back?
Diamond thinks it's because New Guinea is just so rugged. Those mountains, those valleys. Imagine trying to share ideas or trade goods across that kind of terrain. It would have been incredibly difficult. So even within the same island, you've got these really different paths playing out because of geography.
It's like Diamond's thesis is proving itself over and over. Okay, so we've got to talk about Africa. We can't leave that out of the equation.
Absolutely not. Africa is incredibly diverse, but Dahlman, he sees this common thread. They just didn't have as many animals that were suitable for domestication, and he argues that's had a huge impact on how those societies developed.
Okay, so back to the zebras. Not enough horses, not enough oxen to pull plows.
It's a bit more complicated than that. Remember, domesticated animals, they weren't just for transportation or even just for meat. Think milk, wool, fertilizer. They were essential for really developing agriculture, for producing enough food to have a surplus. And that surplus, that's what allows people to specialize, to become, potters or weavers or inventors. It kicks off all those other advancements.
So it's like this chain reaction, this domino effect. No domesticable animals, no agricultural surplus, which makes it that much harder to advance technologically to build those big empires we see in other parts of the world.
You got it. And then on top of that, Diamond also points out that Africa's north-south axis, those climatic barriers, they made it harder for agricultural innovations to spread, just like we were talking about earlier.
It's like Africa really got the short end of the stick, geographically speaking, at least according to Diamond. But doesn't he also talk about the Bantu expansion as an example of how, even with those limitations, there was still progress?
He does. It's a really cool example. The Bantu people, they started in West Africa, and they migrated across a huge chunk of the southern half of the continent over thousands of years. They brought agriculture with them, ironworking, even their languages, which had a huge impact on sub-Saharan Africa.
So they were able to kind of overcome those geographic limitations to a certain degree.
Exactly. And Diamond uses them to make a few key points. First, he's saying that even in places without those obvious geographic advantages, innovation can still happen. People find a way. Second, he says that the Bantu, they were able to spread so effectively, partly because they had iron tools, which gave them an edge, and they weren't facing as much competition from the hunter-gatherer groups in those areas.
So technology and even just demographics play a role, too. It's not all just about the environment. Okay, last stop on our world tour, China. What does Diamond say about how geography shaped things there?
China's a really interesting case. It's huge, but it's also relatively isolated. And like the Fertile Crescent, agriculture was adopted there really early on, so they had that head start.
But they were isolated, kind of like Australia. Did that end up hurting them in the long run?
That's the big question. Early on, that isolation might have actually been beneficial. It probably protected them from early invaders, allowed them to develop a really distinct culture. But Diamond argues that it also meant that they weren't getting the same level of exposure to new ideas, new technologies. He thinks that's part of the reason why Europe eventually surpassed them, technologically speaking.
So that interconnectedness, those networks of exchange, it's a double-edged sword. It can be both a blessing and a curse.
Totally. And remember, Diamond's not saying geography is the only factor. He knows that cultural choices matter, that historical accidents can change everything, that even individuals can have a huge impact. He uses the example of the QWERTY keyboard to illustrate this point.
Okay, now you've got to explain that one. What do keyboards have to do with the fate of entire societies?
Well, think about it. The QWERTY keyboard, the one we're all using right now, it wasn't designed to be the most efficient layout. The arrangement of the letters, it was actually meant to prevent typewriter keys from jamming. But somehow, this random design choice, this historical accident, it became the standard.
And now we're stuck with it, even though it's probably not the best way to do things.
Exactly. And Diamond's point is that similar things, these small, seemingly insignificant choices or events, they might have played a role in shaping the trajectories of entire societies. It's kind of humbling, isn't it?
It really is. So after this whirling tour of history, where do we end up? What's the big takeaway from Guns, Germs, and Steel? Should we just accept that our fate is predetermined by geography?
Not at all. Diamond doesn't want us to walk away thinking geography is destiny. He's giving us a framework, a new way of understanding why our world looks the way it does. He wants us to see those connections, those deep links between the environment, food production, technology, disease, even those seemingly random cultural choices. But he also acknowledges that there's always an element of chance, of free will, and just the unpredictable nature of, well, being human.
It's not just about what happened in the past, it's about how we understand it and what lessons we can take from it, right? For the present, for the future. Makes you wonder if we could rewind, start over, would it all happen the same way? Or are there too many factors, too many what ifs to even imagine?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Diamond's book, it's not a crystal ball, but it's an incredibly powerful tool for understanding those forces that have shaped us. And maybe, just maybe, understanding those forces can help us create a future where those geographic advantages or disadvantages don't completely determine the fate of societies.
It's a lot to process, that's for sure. And I'm willing to bet this won't be the last time we talk about these ideas. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with me and for choosing such thought-provoking material.
The pleasure is all mine. It's always a treat to explore these big questions with someone as curious and engaged as you. Until next time.